She tapped her wine glass twice. The sound cut through the room the way those sounds do at Christmas tables. Clean and deliberate, designed to be heard. I looked up from my plate. I had been talking to Tom's Aunt Vera about a documentary we had both seen, and I had been, for approximately the previous 40 minutes, genuinely happy. It was Christmas Day. There were 40 people in that dining room. Long tables pushed together. The good china that Barbara only brought out twice a year. Candles that she had arranged herself that morning, with the specific attention she brought to things she wanted people to notice. She stood at the head of the table. She was wearing red, which she did every Christmas, a tradition she treated as immovable. She had a glass of white wine in her left hand, and her right hand was at her collar. In the gesture I had come to understand, meant she was about to say something she had prepared. I knew, in the way you know things before they fully form, that something was coming. I did not know what shape it would take. She said, "I love this family. I love every person at this table. And sometimes that love requires a kind of courage that is uncomfortable." She paused. She looked at Tom. She looked at me. She said, "I have been carrying something for several months, and I have decided that this family deserves the truth, even when the truth is painful." She said she had seen me. She described a lunch. She described a man. She described what she said she had witnessed. 2 people at a restaurant in September behaving, in her words, like more than colleagues. She said the man's name. She said she hoped she was wrong. She sat down. The room was completely silent. 40 people and the particular silence of a space where something has just landed that everyone present knows cannot be unlanded. I put my fork down. I looked at Tom. He was looking at his mother. He had an expression I had never seen on his face and have not seen since, and I cannot fully describe, except to say it was the expression of someone watching a car move towards something and being unable to move their own feet. I looked at Tom's cousin Richard, who was sitting 6 seats down the table. Richard was looking at Barbara. Richard's husband David was sitting beside Richard. David was also looking at Barbara. David is my colleague. David has been my friend since the conference in March, where we discovered we both hated the same panel moderator with equal intensity, and had spent 45 minutes, after the closing session, discussing it over terrible conference coffee. David is also, as Richard could have confirmed to anyone who had simply asked, not a person who could have been doing what Barbara was describing. I will tell you why in a moment. I want to tell you my one sentence first. I looked at Barbara. I said, "That is not true." 3 words, quietly, without tears and without volume. I said them to the table, not to her specifically. Not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact with 40 witnesses. That is not true. Then I put my napkin on the table, and I stood up and I said, "Excuse me," and I walked out of the dining room. I got my coat from the hall. I sat in the car and I called my sister. "My name is Maya. I am 36 years old. Tom is 38. We have been married for 6 years. His mother Barbara is 65. And she had just told 40 members of her family, on Christmas Day over the good china and the candles she had arranged herself, that I was having an affair. Let me tell you who Barbara is. Then let me tell you who Richard's husband David is. Then let me tell you what happened next. Barbara is the kind of person who has appointed herself the moral authority of her family, without anyone having voted on the matter. She is warm and generous and genuinely loves her people in the way of someone who believes that love grants access and access grants rights. Rights over information, over decisions, over the narratives of the people she loves. She has strong opinions about everything and shares them as freely as weather. She had opinions about our apartment before we bought the house. She had opinions about the house. She had opinions about when we should have children, and how many, and in what configuration. None of these opinions had ever been solicited. All of them had been delivered with the specific authority of someone who considers her love a credential. Tom managed this by being the particular kind of son who has learned to exist in the space between his mother's version of things and reality without fully inhabiting either. He loved her. He accommodated her. He did not challenge her directly, except when he had to, and he had a high threshold for when he had to. I had, over 6 years, accepted this as part of the marriage. Not without cost. Not without the specific quiet grief of occasionally watching the person you love choose peace over truth, when truth would have been more useful. That I had accepted it. I had accepted it right up until she tapped her wine glass twice. Now let me tell you about David. David Chen is 39 years old. He has been with Richard, Tom's cousin, for 11 years. They married 3 years ago at a ceremony that Tom and I attended, and at which we danced for a long time at the reception, and went home happy and slightly sunburned. David and I had known of each other through the family connection for years before we actually met properly at the March conference and discovered the mutual hatred of the panel moderator. Since March, we had become genuine friends. We had lunch approximately twice a month, sometimes with Richard, sometimes just the two of us. Always at a restaurant near our offices because it was convenient. Always in the middle of the day because we both worked late, and neither of us liked dinner without our respective partners. I had told Tom about David. I had mentioned the lunches. I had mentioned the conference friendship. He had not flagged any concern, because there was no concern to flag. What Barbara had seen in September at a restaurant was David and me having lunch. She had not recognized David, which was not a surprise given that she and Richard were not close, and David and Richard lived in a different part of the city and were not regular features at family gatherings. She had seen a man with her daughter-in-law at a restaurant at lunchtime, and she had built a story around it and carried the story for 3 months. And then she had delivered it at Christmas dinner to 40 people before asking a single question. Not to Tom. Not to me. Not to Richard, who had been available for asking at every family event since March. She had not asked. She had decided, and she had waited for the moment with the most witnesses. I want you to hold that. She had waited for the moment with the most witnesses. She had tapped a glass at Christmas dinner in front of 40 people, not despite the witnesses, but because of them. The witnesses were the point. I want to tell you what happened in the dining room after I walked out. I was not there for it. I heard it from 4 different people over the next 4 days. Each account slightly different in detail and identical in shape. After I left the room, the silence held for approximately 8 seconds. Then Richard stood up. Not dramatically. Richard is not a dramatic person. He stood up in the specific way of someone who has a fact to contribute, and is going to contribute it regardless of the social cost of doing so. He said, "Barbara, I want to make sure I am understanding what you just said." He said, "The person you saw Maya with in September. You said his name." He said, "That is my husband." Barbara looked at him. Richard said, "David and Maya became friends at the conference in March. I have had lunch with both of them. So has my mother. David is many things, but he is not having an affair with Maya because he is. And I hope this is not news to anyone at this table, married to me." The room went very still in a different way from the silence after Barbara's announcement. The first silence had been the silence of shock at what had been said. This silence was the silence of 40 people processing what had just been revealed. Tom's aunt Vera later told me she had looked at Barbara's face and seen something she described as the architecture of certainty collapsing. The specific expression of a person whose story has just been dismantled in public by a fact they did not possess. Barbara said, "I didn't know David was." Richard said, "You didn't ask." Those 3 words, "You didn't ask," delivered without heat, without performance, without any intention beyond the statement of a simple and devastating truth. You had the information available. You chose not to seek it, You chose instead to stand up at Christmas dinner and tell 40 people that my husband is having an affair with his wife. You didn't ask. Tom had said nothing during any of this. He had sat at the table while his mother made her announcement, and he had sat at the table while Richard dismantled it, and he had sat at the table while people looked at him waiting for him to say something. He told me later that he had been frozen. That is the word he used. Frozen. He said he had known immediately that what Barbara was saying was wrong, not because of anything evidentiary, but because he knew me, and the accusation was simply not a thing that matched any version of reality he inhabited. He said he had wanted to speak, and had not been able to make his mouth form words before I had said my 3 words and left the room. He said the Richard intervention had happened before he had reassembled himself. He said he was ashamed of the frozen part. I told him later that I had needed more than the frozen part to be okay. But I am getting ahead of myself. I was in the car when most of this happened. My sister answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to sit here until I know." She said, "I am coming." I said, "No." I said, "I need to think." She said, "Okay." She stayed on the phone and did not talk. That is one of the things I love most about my sister. She knows when being present means being quiet. I sat in the car in Barbara's driveway on Christmas Day, and I looked at the front of the house where the lights were on and the candles were visible through the window, and I thought about 40 people and good china and the name Barbara had said out loud, and the 45 seconds between her glass tap and my 3 words. I thought about Richard's 3 words. I thought about the architecture of certainty collapsing. Then I thought about January. January was going to require a lawyer. Tom came out to the car 40 minutes later. He sat in the passenger seat without being asked, and he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have spoken." I said, "Yes." He said, "I froze." I said, "I know you froze." I said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to hear it without defending yourself." He said, "Okay." I said, "What your mother did tonight was not a mistake. It was not an excess of concern. It was a decision. She watched me for 3 months. She waited for the moment with the most witnesses. She had 40 people in a room, and she chose that room and that moment and those 40 people deliberately." He was quiet. I said, "And when she sat down afterward, the first thing she was going to need to tell herself was that she had acted out of love. That love had given her the courage to say the hard thing. She is going to frame this as courage for the rest of her life, unless someone makes it cost something." He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to go home tonight. I want to call a lawyer on the 2nd of January. I want to address this through a process that is not a Christmas argument or a family mediation, or a conversation where she cries and says she was only trying to help." Tom said, "A lawyer." I said, "She made a false statement about me to 40 people." Richard stood up and corrected the record, and I am grateful to Richard for the rest of my life for that. But the correction happened in the same room, and the correction will not travel as far or as fast as the original statement. The people who were looking at their plates and not at Richard are going to carry what Barbara said. He said, "I know." I said, "A lawyer?" He said, "Yes." We drove home. We did not go back inside. Tom texted his father from the car to say we had left. His father responded with a single word. "Okay, that was Christmas." January arrived. I called Miss Park on the 2nd. She was an attorney my company used for employment matters, and she referred me the following morning to a colleague who handled civil defamation. His name was Mr. Lee. He was 50, efficient, and he asked the same first question every lawyer I have ever dealt with seems trained to ask. He said, "What do you want as an outcome?" I said, "I want Barbara to understand that what she did had legal consequences. I want those consequences to be documented. I want a formal acknowledgement that the statement was false. I want it to cost her enough that she never does this to me or to anyone else. He said, those are achievable goals. He said, what you have is a false statement of fact delivered orally to a large group. He said, the statement damaged your reputation because the 40 people present included family members, social connections, and in at least 2 cases, professional acquaintances who were also at the table. He said, you have 40 witnesses. He said, some of those witnesses will be willing to provide statements. I said, how many do you need? He said, 6 with direct witness testimony would be substantial. I said, I think I can get 6. He said, let us find out. I reached out to 6 people. I did it carefully and individually, not as a group, because I did not want the request to feel like a campaign. I called each person separately, and I told them I was pursuing a legal matter related to what had happened at Christmas, and that I would like to know if they would be willing to provide a written witness statement about what they had observed at the table. I told them there was no pressure, and that I understood completely if they did not want to be involved. Not a single person said no. Richard said yes immediately, and said David would also provide a statement, and that both of them were prepared to say everything they had said at the table and more in writing and under oath if necessary. Tom's aunt, Vera, said she had been thinking about what Barbara had done since Christmas Day, and that she would provide whatever statement was useful. 2 of Tom's other cousins said yes. A professional colleague of Tom's father who had attended as a family friend and had been seated 3 places from Barbara said yes, and added that he had found Barbara's statement troubling enough that he had been considering how to raise it with Tom independently. 6 statements, all of them describing the same event from different vantage points around the same table. Mr. Lee said when he had read all 6, "This is comprehensive," he said. The consistent accounts from 6 independent witnesses with no apparent coordinated narrative strengthen the factual record considerably. He said, "We send a formal letter." Barbara's response to the letter, which arrived through her own lawyer, was that she had been acting out of genuine concern for her son's well-being, and that her statement had been made in a private family gathering, and not in a public forum. Mr. Lee addressed both points. He said that genuine concern is not a defense to defamation, and that a statement made to 40 people, including professional acquaintances, cannot reasonably be characterized as private. He said, the statement was false, it was delivered to a substantial audience, and it caused reputational harm in both family and professional circles. He attached the 6 witness statements. Barbara's lawyer came back 2 weeks later and said his client was willing to provide a written acknowledgement that her statement had been inaccurate and to make a financial contribution toward any documented costs associated with the matter. The financial contribution she offered was $4,500. Mr. Lee said that was not the number. The number we had established was $30,000, calculated on documented reputational harm and the scope of the audience. Barbara's lawyer said his client did not have $30,000. Mr. Lee said then your client should have considered the cost before she tapped her glass. There was a pause in the negotiation. It lasted 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Barbara called Tom 4 times. He answered twice. Both times she said she had not meant to cause harm. Both times Tom said, "Then write the acknowledgement." She said, "The acknowledgement feels like an admission." He said, "It is an acknowledgement." She said, "That what I said was wrong." He said, "That what you said was false." She said, "I believed it." He said, "You didn't ask." He used Richard's 3 words. She was quiet. He said, $20,000 and a written acknowledgement, or we go to court. She signed the acknowledgement. The settlement was $22,000. The acknowledgement said in formal language that the statement made at the Christmas gathering was factually inaccurate, and that Barbara retracted it entirely, and regretted any harm caused. Tom's father had to contribute to the settlement from their joint savings. He did not speak to Barbara for 8 days after signing the transfer. Those 8 days are not my story to tell. But I know they happened because Tom's father called Tom during them, and Tom told me afterward with the specific expression of a person who is processing more than one thing simultaneously. I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I think so." I said, "Is he?" He said, "I think he will be." I said, "That is enough for now." He said, "Yes, that is enough for now." I want to tell you about Tom and the frozen part, because the frozen part was the thing I had to deal with after the legal matter was resolved. And it was in some ways harder than the legal matter, because it did not have a procedure, and it did not have a number, and it did not conclude with a signed document. It concluded with something less defined but more important. Tom had not spoken at the table. He had not defended me in the room where I had needed to be defended. Richard had defended me. I had defended myself with 3 words. Tom had frozen. And the freezing had come from somewhere that predated me, and predated our marriage, and had been building since before he could name it. The specific inability of a person who has spent their whole life inside someone else's authority to challenge it at the moment it matters most. I told him this in February. Not at Christmas. Not in January when the legal process was active. In February when the settlement was signed, and the acknowledgement was filed, and we were sitting in our kitchen on a Sunday morning, and I said, "I need to talk to you about the freezing." He said, "I know." I said, "I need you to understand what it cost me. Not the statement. Not Barbara and her 40 witnesses and her wine glass. What it cost me that you were there and did not speak." He looked at me. He said, "I know what it cost you." I said, "Tell me." He said, "It cost you the certainty that I would choose you. In the moment when it mattered most, I did not choose you, and you felt that, and you have been carrying that since Christmas, and you have managed it while also managing a legal process, and I have been watching you manage both. And I have not said clearly enough that I know what I did, and what I did not do, and that the not doing is the part that I will carry." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to carry it, and I am going to do better." I said, "I know you will, because I believe that. I believe Tom will do better." Because in February on a Sunday morning he said the exactly right thing without prompting, and without defense, and without the conditional phrasing that people use when they are sorry for the circumstances, but not for themselves. He was sorry for himself. That was the right thing. There is a next Christmas. There will always be a next Christmas. We went. I want you to know that we went. We went because Tom's father had asked us directly, and he had been gentle about it, and I had decided that my absence at Christmas was not the statement I wanted to make for the rest of my Christmases. We went. Barbara was there. She did not sit at the head of the table. Tom's father sat at the head of the table. She sat in the middle, between 2 cousins, and she was warm and present, and she did not tap her glass at any point during the meal. She spoke to me once, briefly, when we were both in the kitchen at the same time. She said, "I am glad you came." I said, "Me too." That was all. 2 sentences. 1 from each of us. A beginning that did not pretend to be more than it was. I can work with a beginning that does not pretend. That is the most honest thing I know how to offer about where we are. Here is my question for you. If your mother-in-law announced to 40 people at Christmas dinner that you had cheated, and your husband froze instead of defending you in the room, could you have forgiven the frozen part? Ntaytaesh or nah? Tell me in the comments. There is one thing I have not told you yet. About Richard. About what Richard did in the months after Christmas that I did not ask him to do, and that I did not find out about until March. Richard had, in the weeks after the settlement, compiled a brief account of what had happened, and shared it quietly with the family members who had not been at the Christmas dinner. Not broadcast. Not a campaign. Individual conversations. He felt, as he told me later, that the family narrative deserved to be accurate, and that the people who had not been there had only Barbara's version, and that Barbara's version was not accurate. He did not say this to cause pain. He said it because he believed that accuracy mattered, and that the 40 people who had been there would remember what Richard had stood up and said, and that it was only fair that the rest of the family knew the same thing. Tom's uncle, who had not been at the dinner, called Tom in March and said he had spoken with Richard and wanted Tom to know that he and his wife were fully on the side of what was right, and that they were sorry they had not been there to stand up too. Tom told me this. I sat with it for a moment. Then I called Richard. He answered on the first ring. I said, "I heard what you did." He said, "I just wanted the record to be straight." I said, "Richard, you stood up on Christmas Day in your mother-in-law's dining room and corrected a lie in front of 40 people. And then you spent months making sure the rest of the family had the same information." I said, "That is one of the most decent things anyone has ever done for me." He said, "You didn't ask." I said, "What?" He said, "You didn't ask me to stand up." I just did. I laughed. I said, "You did." He said, "You didn't ask me to talk to the rest of the family." I said, "No." He said, "Then we are even." I said, "We are very much not even." He said, "We are even. He is Tom's cousin and David is my friend, and they came to our apartment for dinner the following month, and we ate David's cooking, which is extraordinary, and we talked about everything except Christmas. And then at the end of the evening Richard said she tapped the glass because she thought the witness count was on her side. I said, "Yes." He said, "She miscounted." I said, "She did." He said, "One of her witnesses was married to the man she was describing." He said, "You could not have planned that." I said, "No." He said, "Some things arrange themselves." I said, "Some things do." We said goodnight. We hugged in the doorway. The night was cold and the street was quiet, and I walked back into our apartment, and Tom was doing the dishes. And I thought about 40 people and a wine glass and 3 words that had landed in a silent room. And I thought about the 3 other words that had come 6 seats down the table and dismantled everything she had built in the time it takes to say you didn't ask. Some things arrange themselves. That is the whole story. Let me give you the full timeline because it shows you the shape of something that in the living of it felt like chaos, but in retrospect had a very clear architecture. December 25th. Barbara taps the glass. 3 words from me. 3 words from Richard. I leave. Tom comes to the car 40 minutes later. We drive home. December 26th. Tom texts his parents. His father responds with 1 word. Tom calls me 3 times to ask how I am and what I need. I tell him I need him to not call his mother until we have a plan. December 28th. I call my sister and we talk for 2 hours. She says the same thing she always says when I need to hear it, which is that I am allowed to protect myself and that she will help in whatever way I need. December 31st, New Year's Eve. We stay home. We order food. We watch something neither of us can remember. We hold hands on the couch. That is the whole evening. And it is the right evening. January 2nd. I call Mr. Lee. January 5th. First meeting. January 12th. Formal letter sent. January 15th. Barbara calls Tom for the first time. He does not answer. January 22nd. Barbara's lawyer makes contact. January 23rd through February 14th. The negotiation. February 15th. Settlement signed. $22,000. Written acknowledgement. Done. March. Richard talks to the rest of the family. Tom's uncle calls. April. Dinner with Richard and David. David's extraordinary cooking. You didn't ask. Some things arrange themselves. That is the whole timeline. Each step was just the next step. None of them required rage. None of them required confrontation in the room. None of them required me to be anything other than someone who knew what had been done, and what the appropriate response to it was, and who moved through the steps, without burning anything down that did not need to be burned. Barbara made her announcement to 40 witnesses thinking the witnesses were hers. She miscounted. The witness count was 40 minus 1. And the one who miscounted was her. I said 3 words. Richard said 3 more. And then January did the rest. That is the story. All of it true. All of it mine. Here is what I know now that I did not know on Christmas morning, when I sat down to the good china and the candles and the 40 people and thought for 45 happy minutes about a documentary and Tom's Aunt Vera and the particular pleasure of being genuinely, straightforwardly happy. I know that a lie delivered to 40 witnesses is also a statement delivered to 40 witnesses when it is corrected. I know that the volume at which something is said is not the same as the weight of it. She said it loudly. Richard corrected it quietly. The correction did not travel as far immediately, but it traveled. It traveled because Richard made sure it traveled, and because the truth, when it is specific and documented and supported by 6 written statements and a signed acknowledgement, and the firm voice of a lawyer who knows the deterrence component is not the flexible part, travels further than a lie told to 40 people at a Christmas table by someone who thought the witnesses were hers. She miscounted. That is the whole thing.